Well, good morning, everybody. It's good, good to see you this morning. It's been great to have Lance with us throughout the month of July. I enjoyed his messages immensely. Enjoyed a little time off, a little vacation in the middle of July, and hope you're getting a break this summer too. Some people, I think, have too much time on their hands. Like the guy who sat down and figured out that in the Gospels, in the life and narratives of Jesus, he was asked 183 questions. I think he had too much time on his hands to figure that out. But it's helpful because he was questioned a lot about a lot of things. What's fascinating is that most of the questions really weren't questions. They were the kind of statements that were a trap. They were a setup. And it really didn't matter which way Jesus answered the question. He couldn't win. Maybe that's why, as you read through the Gospels, out of 183 questions, Jesus only directly answered 3. And the story we're going to look at today is one of those. It's in Luke chapter 10. So an expert of the law came to Jesus and stood up and to test him by asking question. Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? What's written in the law? Jesus replied. How do you read it? The man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You're exactly right, Jesus said. Do this, and you'll live. And then the man, it's a great phrase here, who wanted to justify his actions, asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Imagine that. I think this may be the first time in recorded history that we have a lawyer looking for a loophole. But he was. He was looking for a different kind of an answer. The essence of his question was, what kind of people do I have to serve? It's a horrible question. It's a horrible attitude. It's a horrible life philosophy to live that way. This lawyer, in his day and time, lived in a region of the world that was filled with poverty, filled with homelessness, diseases running rampant. He walked past it all the time, heading from his home to his place of work, which probably was the temple. And the core of the question that he asks Jesus, who is my neighbor, shows us that he was incapable of seeing the needs around him and understanding the pain in his world. So we're going to look at the story of this lawyer this morning and the question that he asked to Jesus. And I honestly believe to the core of my being that he wasn't really looking for an answer to his question. In fact, the scripture says he was just looking for a way that would make him feel justified for his narcissistic behavior. It's reasonable, though, to believe that if Jesus chose to engage this man in some kind of a debate, that he could gain some religious or some political capital by arguing down one of the chief lawyers. Instead, Jesus told the man a parable. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at 5 different parables that Jesus told and the situations around them. If you're not familiar with parables, they're just simply a story. The story can be real or it could be a made-up story. But it's designed for the express purpose of putting spiritual truth into an easily understandable language. As a general rule, when Jesus told a parable, these simple, practical, everyday stories had a single point of emphasis. You might draw some application from other parts, but the real point of the parable was one thing. So as we dig into these parables over these 5 weeks, we're going to look for that central truth, what I've called the moral of the story that Jesus told. And we specifically want to see how it applies to our daily life. The parable that Jesus told this lawyer is a great place to begin this 5-week journey. So he tells him this story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. The Greek word literally says violent men. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him up, and they left him half dead by the side of the road. To the Jewish audience, they fully got the details and the setting for this story. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a 17-mile road that descended 4,000 feet in elevation between the two cities. It was a strenuous road on its own. It wound through mountain passes, through canyons and valleys. But adding to the distress of the journey was the fact that bandits had great places to hide and attack individuals who were traveling on that road, and it happened as a regular occurrence. Jesus goes on to say, by chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed over to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there. But he also passed by on the other side. History tells us that the city of Jericho was a residence for 12,000 priests and temple assistants. It was their home. They didn't live in Jerusalem. They lived in Jericho. This road was a part of their commute to and from work. And though they didn't do it every day, they did it multiple times a year to go and serve in the temple. They were familiar with this road. They were familiar with people being beat up and robbed on this road. And the fact that they walked by this man doesn't mean that they're bad people. I think it just means that they were preoccupied with their own life. I got to get to work. I got to get home. Or if they surveyed the situation, they go, you know what? Those robbers may be using this half-dead man as bait. If I stop and help him, the same thing's going to happen to me. And so they crossed over to the other side of the road, so they didn't even have to look at him and went on their way. Maybe they'd just seen this scenario too often, and they'd gotten calloused to this man's pain. And so they walked by without helping him. And this is where, for the people listening to this story for the first time, it kind of breaks the story form, the predictable storyline that they had gotten used to. It's kind of this descending order of importance in the characters that show up. It's this descending level of respect and credibility. You've got a priest who's at the pinnacle of his career. He is respected by the people. Then you have a temple assistant. Bible elsewhere calls them Levites. They did the menial tasks around the temples. So you go, well, if this high and holy man didn't do it, what's the middle guy going to do? He walks by too. So you'd have a third person. That would finish out the story. And to the Jewish listeners, the logical third person for this story would be a devout Jew who would win the day. Instead, Jesus flips the script. He says, then a despised Samaritan came along. There was bad blood between the Jews and the Samaritans for centuries. To the Jews, the Samaritans were heretics and half-breeds. They would often, in conversation, instead of saying Samaritan, they would say those stupid people. It just leaked out of them how much they hated the Samaritans. And some of them even prayed, especially the religious leaders prayed, that God would not let the Samaritans into heaven, or at least not let them live in my neighborhood in heaven, right? I tried all week long to think of some kind of a comparison for us of somebody that we would hold that kind of disdain for. It's just this oxymoron, good Samaritan. It'd be kind of like us saying a good IRS agent, you know, or a good Packers fan. I mean, it's just there's a dissonance between those two things. So there was some bad blood. Got the picture? This despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged him. And then he took him, put him on his own donkey, and took him to an inn where he took care of him. And the next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins and told him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. One author said the best way for us to capture this concept of the risk personally this Samaritan took with this action would be to roll back the clocks in America, to imagine an American Indian walking into Dodge City, Kansas in 1875 with a scalped cowboy draped over his horse. Imagine that Indian then going and checking into the hotel that's in the rooms above the saloon and staying the night to care for this cowboy. Most of the town, most of Dodge City wouldn't even bother to ask what happened. They would just make assumptions, and they would assume the worst. It would have been the same scenario for this Samaritan to walk into the city of Jericho with this wounded Jewish man draped over his donkey. Jesus, by using a Samaritan to do this, turned this lawyer's world upside down. The question that launched this whole discourse for this Jewish lawyer was, who do I need to serve? Really? I mean, of all the needs that are out there in the world, of all the people groups and problems, which ones really matter? Instead, Jesus teaches him, this is what compassion looks like. And he closed out the story, and now he poses a question back to the lawyer, a question of his own. He says, so which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by the bandits? The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. It's just a hint of the animosity there. He won't even say that Samaritan. He says it's the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, okay, you're right. Now you go and do the same. The key to this parable is found early on in Jesus' words. In one simple statement, he says, when the Samaritan saw the man, he felt compassion for him. In the Greek, the word compassion is a strong word. It means that we're deeply moved, that we're shaken up. It's like a jar with all kinds of silt in the bottom of it that's settled. And you just take it and shake it violently, and everything is mixed up together, and you can't make sense of it anymore. The focus of the story is not, who do I have to serve? The focus is, how do I show compassion? How do I be a compassionate person? What does that look like? That's what God wants. When compassion gets a hold of us, I'm confident that it shakes up our values. It changes how we see and serve people around us. All kinds of people. People we barely know. People who hold different political views than us. People who hold different religious opinions or no religious opinion at all. People we don't like, and though we're ashamed to admit it, people we hate. If we're looking for the moral to this story, it's this. Compassion is not an obligation to be fulfilled. It is the love of God tangibly expressed from a changed heart. Once we fully understand what God has done for us, the compassion he has shown to us in saving us, forgiving us, calling us his sons and daughters, when we understand the compassion we've been given, it should change our heart and open it wide up to show compassion to the myriad of people who cross our path. Initially, compassion should change how we see things in this world. It happened to the Samaritan. The man by the side of the road was not a casualty of a political or religious conflict. There was animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans, but this man had done nothing wrong to the Samaritan. He wasn't a victim of his own bad decisions. The man dying in front of him was a person who needed tangible compassion. The Samaritan's actions were radically different than the others in the story, or even what you would expect from a stereotypical Samaritan. He was willing to get involved. He poured wine into the man's wounds to help cleanse them. He may have poured some wine into the man to help with his pain. He poured olive oil into the wounds as a salve to begin some of the healing process and to ease some of the pain. He bandaged the man. I doubt the donkey he'd bought came with a first aid kit. And so to bandage the man meant he would reach into his own clothing and begin to tear it into strips and wrap it around those wounds to stop the bleeding. He was willing to inconvenience himself to serve somebody else. He would walk the balance of the 17 miles to Jericho because he put the wounded man on his donkey He felt compassion and he acted on it. All this happened because he really saw the man. He really saw his need and didn't rationalize it away. Which begs the question for you and me. Are we really seeing the world around us? Are we paying attention to the little things? Do you notice houses in your neighborhood that have started to run down a little, normally kept up really well, and they're running down a little? Do we care enough to discover why? Could it be there's an elderly couple living in there, can't keep up the house anymore? Maybe one of them's caring for the other as they're sick. Maybe it's a single parent who's living in that house now, was a married couple, now a single parent, and there aren't the resources and there's not the knowledge and there's just not the time to care for the house. Do we see what's going on around us? Our biases have a potential to taint our vision, so that all we see when we see situations around us is we see a people group or a problem that needs to be solved by somebody instead of jumping into the fray. Part of what keeps us from jumping into the fray, though, is the simple truth that compassion, tangible acts of expression of compassion, can get really messy. They require us to get personally involved. The Samaritan didn't stand on the other side of the road, open his pack, and throw some bandages to the guy and say, I hope this helps. He got physically involved. He personally cared for this half-dead man. It was a mess to clean him up and bandage his wounds. I would imagine the blood that got on him permanently stained his clothes, ruined the saddle that was on his donkey. Compassion can get really messy. I remember the first time, fairly new to Chicago, and I took a group of people into the Austin neighborhood in Chicago. It's one of the worst neighborhoods in Chicago. We went in, we served for a full 8-10-hour day. We were spent, and as we walked back outside to the parking lot to get in our vans to go home, all the tires and rims were gone. I went back in, I talked to the director of compassion in the church that we were serving at and told her what happened, and she just laughed. She said, welcome to the hood. Chicago cops we called didn't want to come help. They said, just write up the report and email it in. That's a rough neighborhood. Really? I think we kind of got that picture. Compassion can get messy. First time that I went to serve in the Dominican Republic, it was my first experience in a third world country. We began to serve in a barrio outside of the capital city. And it was messy. The biggest mess of all that we encountered in that week was the fact that the man who worked for an international organization who was running the project that we were on in the city was Puerto Rican and had a racial bias against the Dominicans. Well, that got messy real quick when he started using slurs and slang about them that was demeaning and degrading. And I think about the mess of compassion. I tried to pin down what I think is the biggest mess of compassion that we've gotten into in the last year at Westridge. It was the Christmas toy drive. There was a lot of chaos around that. We served hundreds of families on a Saturday morning with a breakfast with Santa and projects for the kids and parents' ability to come in and pick out incredible toys for their kids. It was the first time these families had been on our campus. And it was a serving project we'd never done before. If you're the kind of person that runs by strict schedules, rules, systems, and processes, it messed with you because it was a messy day around here. And it rocked. It was an incredible day. It was the highlight of my Christmas, and I would guess for everybody else that was here. It was worth it alone just to see John Doyle dressed up as Buddy the Elf. I'm just going to say. It's something I've already started thinking about on my calendar. It's got to happen on a Saturday when I can be here because I was so blessed to be a part of it. I didn't lead it. I was just serving, and it was fun, but it was messy. Tangible personal expressions of compassion will seldom be safe or easy. They'll push us beyond our comfort zones. And we have to be willing to dive into the mess and love people who may be hard to love in circumstances that we don't understand. But I can promise you, compassion is always worth it. When we dive into situations that are beyond our control, we're all of a sudden doing something that's so big that if God's not in it, we'll fall flat on our face. That's faith. And when we do it, we learn that there is no situation, no mess we'll encounter that is too big for God's mercy or too far beyond His grace. One more quick truth about compassion. Compassion is going to cost us something if we get involved. It cost the Samaritan a lot. It cost him his time. He was on that road because he had a place to go. He had people to see. He had business to conduct. Compassion demanded that he set his agenda aside and serve. Most of us at Westridge are busy, busy people. We just are. It's the pace of life in Chicago. We have lots of plates spinning between our family and our work and a little bit of personal or health time in there, and sleep is at a premium. And even when compassion captures our heart, we feel stirred and shaken by it. We wonder how we'll manage to fit it in to a packed life. Compassion cost the Samaritan a significant amount of money. The Bible says that when he left 2 silver coins with the innkeeper. I just look at that and I go, oh, like, $2 silver or something. I mean, it wasn't a big deal, right? It was a huge deal for this man. Those 2 silver coins represented 2 full days' wages. How many of us, in an instance like that, encountering a great need, would have the margin in our budget, would have the money in our pocket to just cough up 2 full days of wages to help care for a person? I spent some time on the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics website this week. I know that makes you envious of the cake job that I have, because all of you want to just dig into Bureau of Statistics stuff, right? But I did it with a very specific purpose. I wanted to figure out what's the median income. What would that 2 days' wages look like today? And I found it. You get to that because there's 261 work days. The geeks in the room need this, okay? So the rest of you can come back in just a second. 261 working days in an average year. And so you would take household median income, divide it by 261, multiply it by 2, and you've got your number, right? If you live in the city of Elgin, the average household income, 2 days' wages, would amount to $460. If you live in St. Charles or South Elgin, it's $670. If you live in Geneva, it's $760. I'm going to move to Geneva so I can be more generous. That's all I'm saying. Now, you don't have to pull out your billfold this morning. You know how much money is in there. And you know the answer to the question I'm going to ask. Could you, in a moment, when a need presents itself, be able to hand over that kind of money to help someone? If a need presented itself on the way home today, do you have that kind of margin in your budget and in your life? I think that, honestly, is the greatest payoff to learning to manage our finances well. It teaches us how to spend correctly, yes. It teaches us how to save, yes. It teaches us how to invest. But it opens the door for us to live incredibly generous lives. And generosity doesn't have to always, thank goodness, take the place of 2 days' wages. It can be small things. We can start being compassionate in small steps. A couple weeks ago, I was in Starbucks. Yes, I'm an addict. And no, I don't want your support group. The line was long, and my appointment had canceled. The person who was meeting me there couldn't show up. So I was standing in line. I was just going to get something and take it and bring it back to the office and just enjoy it. So I kind of got lost on my phone for a minute or two, and I realized this line was taking longer than I thought it normally did. And the guy in front of me was struggling. I mean, he placed his order, the barista had put it in, and the guy went to pay with the app on his phone, and it wasn't working. And then they realized he didn't have money left in his account. That's why it's not working. And so the barista was trying to coach him on how to replenish that, and it might take a minute or two, and the guy was getting seriously flustered. And I could hear the people behind me in line starting to do that deep harumph, that sigh, that, says a lot without saying anything. And I just, in that moment, I don't always do this, but in that moment, I just felt God whisper to me and go, hey, you could pay for his coffee. It'd be about the same as your appointment was going to be. So I just reached around with my phone, put the scanner in front of it, and it went blink. And it literally made that sound. The barista looked over at me and thanked me with a smile because he sensed the frustration in the line. The guy was completely befuddled. He didn't know what had happened. When the barista told him, he turned around and looked at me and went, oh my gosh, thank you. Are you going to be here a while? I'll go to an ATM. I'll get the money and I'll bring it to you. And I went, it's okay. I got it. Maybe you'll see somebody later in the day or later this week even, that needs that kind of help. Just pay it forward. He wasn't half dead by the side of the road. He might have been if he didn't get his coffee. It didn't cost me 2 days' wages, in spite of the fact it was in Starbucks. And I hate telling stories, honestly, that make me look like the hero, because more often than not, I'm the zero, and it's a quick step. But in that one instance, I'm simply thankful that I saw this chance to show compassion to someone, to stretch my faith, to listen to God, to be inconvenienced a little bit. Because at the core of being compassionate is not the question, who do I need to serve? It's who do I want to be? How am I going to let the grace and love of God change me? It's not about the other person's identity, the one we serve. It's about our identity in Christ. And when we realize the full extent of God's grace, it ought to move us towards compassion to everyone. It ought to cause us to open our hearts because we see people and situations differently. It'll cause us to set aside our plans and to walk into messes we see in our community and our world. It will cause us to follow through with acts of compassion that open our wallets and our calendars and our heart. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus calls us to be people, not just people who know the right answers, but who live those answers out. He calls us to be people who see the world, really, truly see the world around us. To see people stranded by the side of the road and stop and help. To see people in the grocery store who are in a wheelchair, can't reach the groceries they need, that are on a shelf too high, and have the compassion to stop and just help. To see the stranger who looks lost as they're walking down the street or walking through the halls of our church. To see them as people who need compassion. To see the kids and the families that live in the Huff neighborhood, not as a social or racial demographic, but as real people in need of tangible acts of love. To see those families, those kids that we serve in Nicaragua and provide clean water and better education and a better way of life, as children of God who desperately need His love and our compassion. The call to follow Jesus is to live a life with our eyes wide open and our hearts at the ready. To set aside the limits and the boundaries and the safeguards that often restrain us, and to recklessly, tangibly express the same grace and the same compassion to them that God has shown to us.